Brace the rudders! Raise the sails! Raise the sails!
Captain, an unidentified ship is approaching. Over.
Roger. Wait, is that an Enterprise sales solution?
Reach sales professionals, not professional sailors. With LinkedIn ads, you can target the right people by industry, job title, and more. Start converting your B2B audience today. Spend $250 on your first campaign and get a free $250 credit for the next one. Get started today at linkedin.com/campaign. Terms and conditions apply.
Did you know only 6% of people are getting enough fiber? That's why Quaker created Fiber February, a month-long movement to show your gut a little more love. It's like dry January, only easier and more delicious. Quaker has over 100 delicious options that are a good source of fiber. So go buy Quaker Oats today and join the Fiber February movement for a healthy gut.
The world moves fast. Your workday, even faster. Pitching products, drafting reports, analyzing data. Microsoft 365 Copilot is your AI assistant for work. Built into Word, Excel, PowerPoint, and other Microsoft 365 apps you use. Helping you quickly write, analyze, create, and summarize. So you can cut through clutter and clear a path to your best work. Learn more at Microsoft.com/M365 Copilot.
Welcome to the New Books Network.
I'm Chris Holmes, and this is Burned by Books. Here you'll find interviews with writers you already love, like Jennifer Egan and Rebecca Mackay, mixed in with up-and-coming voices like Alexandra Kleeman and Rumaan Alam. You'll find us wherever you listen to podcasts, but check out previous episodes at burnedbybooks.com and on Instagram and Twitter at burnedbybooks. Let's start the show. Alice Martin's debut novel, Westward Women, begins with something small, almost dismissible, an itch, a tingling under the skin that spreads slowly on the bodies of women across the United States. And this is followed by something stranger. Those women begin to pick up and leave their lives. Jobs, families, college, relationships, they abandon everything that previously made them who they are, and they head west, towards the Pacific. And when they arrive, some of them disappear. Westward Women is a fever dream of American history, the feminist movements of the 60s counterculture, and the mythology of the American road novel. It begins in the early 1970s when the itch is making women everywhere lethargic and forgetful, even of their own names. Thousands begin migrating across the country, abandoning their lives and a culture that doesn't quite know what to do with them. Alice Martin tells this story via the voices of three women moving through the same strange current of westbound women. There's Aimee, who sets out to find her missing best friend before she herself is absorbed into the viral phenomenon. There's Teenie, already infected, riding west in a van with a mysterious figure known only as the Piper. And Eve, a disgraced journalist chasing the story that might resurrect her career and perhaps unlock an understanding of what is really happening to these westward women. What fascinates me about this novel isn't just the speculative hook, although it's a good one. It's the way Martin takes a very old American story, the westward journey, and flips its emotional gravity. Here the movement west feels something like a collective restlessness, a slow nationwide exodus of women who can no longer remain where they are or who they are expected to be. Westward Women blends road novel, speculative fiction, and feminist parable into something eerie and strangely intimate. A book that feels at times like a dystopian thriller and at others like a quiet meditation on the body, desire, and that deep American impulse to keep moving west. Alice Martin holds a PhD in literature from Rutgers University. She is an assistant professor of English studies at Western Carolina University, where she teaches fiction writing and American literature. She lives outside of Asheville, North Carolina, with her husband, her son, and too many typewriters. Welcome to Burned by Books, Alice Martin.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm such a fan of this podcast, so it's really a pleasure.
Well, I'm so glad that you could come on and talk about this great novel. And I'm wondering if we could get a taste of the voice of something I guess we'd call a kind of like a prologue, and just read a bit from the beginning for us.
Sure. Yeah, I'll read the beginning. This is one of those kind of interstitials that comes up throughout the book of women traveling west. So everyone has a story about the infection. When you tell your story, it goes like this. It started in your fingers, the itch, a tingling like when your hand falls asleep. It traveled up your forearms and down your back in a shiver of foreboding or excitement. When they started trying to examine women like you, they always asked when it started. You couldn't say what started it exactly, but you do know that the itch started sometime after you lost the baby. 4 months into living with your romantic-minded, fidgety boyfriend, you lost the baby in a loosening of blood. You were sleeping when it happened, but the sensation woke you up. You thought it would feel like a punch in your gut. Instead, it was the feeling of a fist unclenching. It felt like relief. You stayed in bed until he went to work at the garage that always left his fingers black with oil and his body smelling of gasoline. By the time you got up and took off the sheets to wash them, it had already seeped into the seams of the mattress, lined the bed in red. You sat in the shower afterward, the water on so hot it scalded your skin. You're not okay, you repeated to yourself. You wanted to make yourself cry, but you couldn't. At first, you told yourself it wasn't a choice. But then you wondered, in the blinding light of your relief, if maybe it was. A choice, but not a choice. Like breathing. Like letting the light in and the life out. After you told him you lost the baby that evening, you went to work at Dairy Queen. At least there, you didn't have to see his face, so shattered and raw and somehow betrayed. But those nights alone at Dairy Queen, you started to feel not so alone after all. You felt as if you were being watched, as if the silent space were crowded with the voices of people you'd known and people you would never meet. It wasn't a presence exactly, but an atmosphere, like the air before a storm, porous and unstable. You felt that atmosphere in the way you would sometimes recognize someone you didn't know or dream about something before it happened. You'd heard rumors about it by then, the infection, that girls in nearby Fayetteville were scratching themselves raw, were disappearing in the night. But when it happened to you, it felt different. It felt as natural as breathing, as inevitable as a blink. It came over you slow, night after night at the Dairy Queen, as you watched the thick television set that was drilled into the corner of the counter. At 7, it always played an old cowboy movie. Westward, the tanned hero proclaimed, always westward. He rode off into a sunset of brilliant technicolor, his chin lifted high toward the horizon. His body was his own, a wild thing that went where it wanted, did what it wanted, when it wanted. Did he never think about who he was leaving behind, you wondered? What would that be like? To have an untamed body that no one could control. You could be anyone or no one. Night after night, you stared into the darkness and listened to peppered gunshots, climactic crescendos, and his voice, which became many voices, all chanting, "Westward, westward, always westward." You whispered it to yourself then, how you wanted to leave him. One day, you told yourself you would leave him. You would leave his romantic daydreaming, so effusive it often suffocated you. You would leave the cold way he sometimes looked at you, like after the baby, like all the light inside of him suddenly went out. You would leave the way he touched you, too hard, with just a little too much nail, like he was trying to reach deep inside you, or maybe tear you apart. Years later, after you left, after you were killed, after the infection had swept the nation, they'd say that since 1973, when the infection truly began to spread, 700,000 girls in the United States went missing. But you knew this would happen all along. You've always just been one of many, or maybe many have been one with you.
Thank you so much, Alice. So you called these interstitials, and I wonder if you'd talk a little bit about how they came to play a role in structuring it, because we have our three narrative voices, but then we have this second person, you directed voice that gives us this larger perspective and context, but also kind of narrows down to one single character as well.
Yeah, so these interstitials actually were a really early part of the writing process for me. Years ago, this was a much different book. It was a much more straightforward literary fiction novel with just one character going west in the 1970s. And the speculative element of this book was much less prominent. There still was a slight speculative element, but the infection wasn't as central as it became. What was still there, despite this just being at that point Aimee's story, were these kind of interstitials. And I had conceptualized them very early on because I wanted this to feel like a movement. I wanted it to feel like a chorus of women, even when there was one protagonist. It just felt like that was a huge part of the point, that there isn't one chosen person, that actually, we're not all that special, that we're all living in this larger context and experiencing it. And it doesn't mean that Aimee's experience or any one character's experience should be dismissed. It just means that they're part of this kind of larger collective. And I thought that was so important. And so the second person interstitials became the way that I did that. But, as often happens, I think, especially with literary novels, early drafts are all ideas. They're all mood, they're all character, they're all ideas. They're not plot. They're not structure. I find plot to be, as a literary writer, I find plot to be so hard. And so when I started editing this novel to kind of give it more plot, I leaned into what the interstitials could be beyond just the idea of the collective or the idea of the chorus, and instead how it might inform kind of external action. So without giving too much away, without giving too much away about what happens in the plot, the interstitials kind of start as this disembodied voice, but then become really central to what guides Aimee's actions.
Yeah, that's really helpful, and I love that they were early on. And also, I think it's so good for writers, especially young writers, to hear that you can, struggle with plot, and that can be something that can come later in the process. Because I think lots of people have this illusion that you have everything mapped out, like on a cork board or something, but it's clear that these interstitials helped guide you, or you use them to guide the plot a little bit, and that's good for people to hear, I think.
Oh yeah, but plot being easy is such a fantasy, I mean, I think maybe it's because I was like raised in workshop environments, and so I was trained to write short stories and trained to really think about style and character, and all of those things are so great, but they really underestimate how hard and how important plot is. And it wasn't until I worked in commercial book publishing as an agent and editor that I was like, oh, all of these books need plot. And so it made me really appreciate commercial writers who know how to do that, and made me want to try to be better at it.
Before we dig into the itch, as it were, I want to talk about the 1970s. You put us in what is, for many people, the decade of general national malaise, although we'll have lots to say about these past few decades, I think. We're in the beginning of a backlash to the counterculture. It's the ending years of the Vietnam War. And some of the promise is starting to leak out of the feminist movements of the 1960s, and women find themselves still stuck in place, stuck in relationship, stuck in a culture that undervalues them. But I wonder why it was important for this story to take place in that particular moment.
Yes, thank you for that. I think it was also like the interstitials, just a central thing that happened really early on, that this story had to be the 1970s. And I'm actually not normally a historical fiction writer, but the reason this had to be the 70s is that the idea for this book actually came from a series of letters and postcards and journals that I read of my mother's.
Hmm.
And yeah, I was writing a dissertation on 19th century American women's ordinary manuscripts, like letters and diaries and notes.
Hmm.
And because wanted to avoid writing my dissertation, I started reading. That's a great way to write a book, is to avoid writing your other book. I started reading all of the manuscripts that my own mother kept in a closet, and she had this one box filled with postcards and photos and letters from a pretty wild trip she took out west in the 1970s. And, I wouldn't say these days that I think of my mom as a super wild person, but this was a trip full of kind of strange stopovers and drug-induced episodes and working in apple orchards to get Greyhound bus tickets home and hitchhiking and all kinds of things. So,
Hmm.
you know, I ended up talking to her about it. I did a little kind of oral history interview with her because I was so fascinated by her and my aunt and these women who were all traveling west at the time and writing letters, who seemed like different women than the ones I knew. And when my mom discusses it, she would always reflect on how it felt. She'd just graduated from college, and college didn't feel important. What felt important was what her sister was doing, which was traveling west in a refurbished van with her then husband. That, like, getting out and going somewhere and doing something felt like what they all needed to be doing, all of them meaning
Hmm.
women her age. She kind of felt as if it were a social movement she were missing out on, even though, of course, it's not a
Hmm.
literal movement in the way that it is in the book. So I wanted to capture that feeling that, the kind of quieter, more constrained traditional life that she was leading was one she wanted to leave behind, because she wanted to map the world as a place to be discovered by her. And I had an
Oh,
early
that's
scene in
really
this.
nicely said.
Thank you. But yeah, I had an early scene in this that got cut, as so many scenes do, about her being in a friend's room, and Aimee being in a friend's room and seeing the vestiges of the 60s and feeling as if she was living in a hangover, that the 70s were just
Hmm.
this hangover
Hmm.
from the 60s, where n- light was like a little too bright and yet not bright enough, and like the excitement was gone, but the effort, the like being sore from the effort of what the 60s was still there. And I think that the symptoms that these women experience of the infection, that kind of soreness, that itch, the sluggishness, all of that kind of ended up embodying that sense of the 70s hangover that I was trying to
Hmm.
capture in that initial scene.
Yeah, and that helps me understand also about the forgetfulness, perhaps the need to kind of let go a little bit of that, memory of all the effort that was expended towards goals that maybe weren't completely achieved in the 60s. And so you have this kind of willed or willful forgetfulness. But I want to, pick up the itch as this fabulous metaphor in a way that you helped frame, I think, by saying that the desire for like physical, literal movement is something that isn't always associated with a movement. And here you have an itch driving physical, kinetic movement to go along with the philosophical and intellectual movement. And I wonder how you sort of settled upon the itch as the thing that brought those kinds of movement together.
Yeah, another great question. There were two kind of simultaneous things. I think a lot of writing is like the alchemy of different things that you encounter around the same time, kind of working together. So part of that alchemy was the letters. Again, my mom, there's one letter where she literally writes, "I'm itching to go," meaning she's itching to go west. And I
Boy,
was
you were
like,
lucky your mom was like such a writer.
yeah, I'm lucky to have my mom for a lot of reasons, but that was one of them for sure. And she, I with any kind of person who writes speculative fiction or literary speculative fiction, I think there's always this impulse to make the metaphorical or the, existential literal. So I was like, oh, she was itching. Maybe she was literally itching. The other thing, the other thing that made me think about it was this great essay by Atul Gawande that was in the New Yorker. I think it was the New Yorker. I really should cite this properly. Years back about kind of the medical diagnosis of the itch and the problems that presents because and he kind of samples a few different people, often women who kind of said they were suffering from an itch that they couldn't shake, and how kind of psychological itches actually are, that once we think something itches, we have to scratch it like crazy, but the longer we scratch it, it doesn't actually satisfy the itch. In fact, sometimes it can beget more itching. So I was
You're
so
making
fascinated.
me itchy now.
Yeah, gonna get in your head. But it's one of those things where if you think about the thing, then you have the thing, which is exactly what I wanted this contagion to be. I wasn't really interested in the biological causes or cures for this infection. I was interested in the idea of social contagion, that you could hear an idea or get an idea in your head and then you had it. That was the communicable thing. And so the itch, felt like that as a medical diagnosis, this thing that straddled the line between the mental and the physical.
This episode is brought to you by Redfin. You're listening to a podcast, which means you're probably multitasking. Maybe even scrolling home listings on Redfin, saving homes without expecting to get them. But Redfin isn't just built for endless browsing. It's built to help you find and own a home. With agents who close twice as many deals, when you find the one, you've got a real shot at getting it. Get started at redfin.com. Own the dream.
This episode is brought to you by Cologuard. Do you know what's really scary? Not screening for colon cancer when you turn 45. The Cologuard test is non-invasive, requires no special prep or time off work, and ships right to your door. In just 3 simple steps, Cologuard takes the scare out of colon cancer screening. If you're 45 or older and at average risk, ask your healthcare provider about the Cologuard test. Cologuard is available by prescription only. Learn more or request a prescription today at Cologuard.com/screen.
Zootopia 2 has come home to Disney+.
Let's go!
Get ready for a new case.
We're the greatest partners of all time!
New friends.
Gary the Snake.
And your last name?
The Snake.
Dream Team. New habitats.
Zootopia has a secret reptile population.
You can watch the record-breaking phenomenon at home. Zootopia 2, now available on Disney+, rated PG. And right now you can get Disney+ and Hulu for just $4.99 a month for 3 months with a special limited time offer. Ends March 24th. After 3 months, plan auto-renews at $12.99 a month. Terms apply.
There's a great, I think it was just a couple of days ago, New York Times article on people who believe they have insects under their skin and are constantly sort of brutally itching themselves, and they get no help from at least traditional medical diagnoses. So that would just add to your already growing understanding of the itch as psychological and self-fulfilling in a way.
My excellent conversation partner at my New York launch, Anna North, referenced that article too. And so I have to check it out. But, the idea that it's insects too under the skin is so relevant to this book. One of Aimee's father's an entomologist, and that's because my maternal grandfather was an entomologist. And the idea of insects are also really relevant here. So that seems like an article I got to read.
Yeah, no, you really do. One of the things I thought you did so nicely in the novel is hold the metaphorical and the physical in constant tension with each other. It doesn't just give way into the metaphorical, and that's part because you allow the metaphorical to take many shapes as you're going along. It's not just a single shaped metaphor for the itch. One of the things that kind of was a moment in the novel where I understood one of those directions was when we get a sense of what the medical establishment's prevention strategy is for this itch, which is to stay indoors and avoid other women, and later that there will be approved sedatives and forced quarantining. One, can you frame this particular kind of medical response to a women's collective movement? And two, how did you balance kind of letting the metaphor grow organically rather than having it be a sort of leaden thing that sort of hung there?
Yes, thank you so much for that. You know, so I used to interview authors, and whenever I would interview authors after the pandemic, they would always be very quick to tell me, this isn't a COVID-19 novel. This isn't a pandemic novel. You know, they were like really enthusiastic about not being considered that. Whereas I'll have to be really honest that of course the pandemic influenced this novel. I wrote early drafts of this novel much before the pandemic, and the idea of the infection was there before the pandemic. But I think my own experiences, or all of our experiences of the pandemic, kind of influence the art that we create or the way we consume art. And so for me, it was, again, that idea of a social contagion that even more so than, approved vaccines or trying to figure out if, like, what caused it. It was more just that idea that the fear that spread and the way that it spread as soon as we thought that maybe it could be on surfaces, right? Or maybe we could get it just by talking to each other or something. And so that, again, the kind of social element of that fear that felt like it compounded on itself was something I wanted to capture here. And I don't think that before the pandemic, I would have been able to totally capture the intense desire to be around people, even when you knew that it might be physically dangerous to yourself, that the need to connect socially or to be intimate with somebody became a physical need, even though it wasn't, even though it was kind of counter actually to what they were saying our physical needs were. And so all of those things, I think, came from my experience of the pandemic, but then felt so true too to the lives of women, when there are expectations that, women, even in situations where they're victims, are told, you can stop yourself from being victimized by dressing differently or by educating yourself more or avoiding bad people, And so those kinds of dictates, combined with my new knowledge of what it felt like to be quarantined, and also my new understanding of how contagions kind of affect different groups of people, different demographic groups of people in very different ways for a variety of social reasons. And so all of that, I think I have to credit to the pandemic. And then ways of not making it feel leaden. I mean, that was like a back and forth in a lot of edits. I would say once this book sold to an editor, structurally not too much changed, but my editors were really helpful in thinking about, how much I had to answer about the contagion and how much I didn't have to. That I really didn't want to answer much about the infection. I wanted to be like, well, what do you think? which I think I still, got to keep, but they helped me think more creatively too about how to maybe provide some hints of answers through conversation and action, like the scenes that you're alluding to, that can kind of make it part of the journey, as opposed to, as you're saying, the more leaden, perhaps, PSA descriptions of what women in this should or shouldn't do. So I'm thinking in particular, I guess there's a scene when one character, Eve, and another character stop at a hostel that's kind of actually it's gotten so big because there are so many women, and they hear different women's experiences, and then they also hear some newscasters speculating on what they think is causing it and how to handle it. Of course, those newscasters are all men. And then they hear the perspective of the church volunteer women who are, quote unquote, helping them. And so all of those different perspectives colliding in one space got to be part of the action instead of part of the exposition.
So the West has been a space of the imagination since the founding of the country. And the frontier narrative has often been about expansion and conquest and forms of reinvention. But I feel like contemporary writers have readdressed that space in terms of its possibilities for people who fall outside of the mainstream or majority understanding of the US, and sometimes particularly for women. I'm thinking most recently of Victor Laval's Extraordinary Lone Women, which used real historical records of women going solo to homestead in early American Western communities. So I know that you drew a lot of inspiration from your mother's writings, but I'm imagining you also drew inspiration from thinking about how novels have been obsessed with the imaginative space of the West for a very long time. And I'd love to hear a little bit about your thoughts.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I love that Victor LaValle novel, so I'm so glad that you mentioned it. That was absolutely on my mind. I mentioned Anna North earlier because her book Outlawed also is doing a
Oh,
lot
it's
of
so
what
good.
it's so
Yeah.
good. But it's doing a lot of what you're describing about, you know, having the frontier suddenly being a place where a utopian dream, right? That maybe we can still find a place for you and me kind of energy. And then there's Ivy Pachoda has a novel called Sing Her Down that's kind of a Western noirish thriller about two women cellmates who kind of are on the run that has an infection element. There's a COVID-19 element to that story, but also, to me, it has a little bit more grittiness, I think, than some of the novels that we've mentioned. Not that those novels aren't gritty, but this one is I confronting that grittiness more, maybe, but it's also that idea of like going off towards the sunset as being a kind of escape. So all of those things were on my mind. I have to admit, I'm typically really skeptical of Western narratives. So like and for the same reason, I think that I'm really skeptical of space narratives because they're often this, I think, like highly masculine, ambitious, I'm going to leave the domestic and go out on my own and, conquer. And like you're saying, I think some of these more recent books are questioning that impulse, but also embracing it to an extent, that the idea of escaping to a new place is kind of the answer. And I'm I'm skeptical of that still. I think this book, hopefully in the way that it ends, asks people to be skeptical of that as well, that even when we try to escape the place that we're from, and I think a lot of these women are explicitly trying to escape the relationships that they felt defined them or the people that they felt defined them in those places, that those relationships and those people kind of travel with them in either real or kind of figurative ways that they can't escape. And that instead of trying to escape them, we might need to really kind of figure out what to do with those relationships that are a little bit more productive. And I don't say that to dismiss the Western narrative because my PhD is in 19th century American literature. That Western imagination, I think, is part of the American fantasy for a reason, and that utopian quality that some of the newer versions of the Western embraces, I think, is here too. But maybe this book, maybe Westward Women, is a little more skeptical of that utopian element of going west. Sometimes having the fantasy, the wanting is important, but it doesn't mean that you are going to get what you want. I don't know that any of these women ultimately think they get what they want. I do have one more novel in the Western tradition to mention, but I'm saving it for the end.
Oh, okay. All right. Good.
Okay.
Well, I'll be anticipating it. So you began by reading one of the interstitial narratives, but we have these three characters who get to take up our narrative voices for much of the novel: Aimee, Teenie, and Eve. Very different, coming from different perspectives, backgrounds, but all caught up in what I think of as this kind of wave, sort of sweeping hundreds of thousands of women westward. And I wonder how you, one, handled the development of the voices of each of them, but also how you balanced a sense of, one, wanting to think about a collectivity and a movement, while also needing to really develop three quite, nuanced and developed characters on their own.
Yeah, I'm like still thinking about your metaphor of the wave. I love that. So many people think about them going towards the water, but I like the idea that the wave could be over the country. Anyway, getting too tied up in your language. These three narrators I mentioned before, it started really just with Aimee. And I think it's because Aimee's narrative is perhaps the most traditional here, where she's right out of college, the coming of age, searching for meaning narrative. But one thing I found when I was trying to write Aimee is like Aimee by herself, I just hated her. I was so annoyed with her in these early drafts. She's like so in her head all the time. That character she's so in her head about her own deficiencies and her own insecurities, especially in relation to her best friend who she's searching for, who's kind of the other side of that coin, or at least she perceives her to be the other side of that coin, a lot more brash and daring and confident. And
is that where Ginny comes from then?
Yes. So Ginny, right. So Ginny was kind of the foil to Aimee in those early books. And it was helpful to have that to illustrate Aimee, but it also was frustrating because then Aimee just seemed like this person who, was pretty annoying to write about, honestly. And I couldn't, I didn't want that to be just who Aimee was. I just needed that was who Aimee perceived herself to be. And the only way I could crack her into kind of like a more complex character was to fracture the story into different perspectives so that these women could see each other through each other's eyes too. And I think this honestly probably still relates back to the fact that the germ of this was in letters. Because the wonderful thing about letters, about correspondences, is that they are never just one person, like we can't say that there's a single author of a letter. It's always a relationship in paper. The person that you are when you talk to one person is so different from the person that you are when you talk to someone else. So when I read the letters from my mother to my aunt and back and forth, I got to see the women who they were in relation to each other, not in relation to me. And so that really made the multiple perspectives sing for me because I could do that there too. I could find a way that they were able to kind of, their characters could be developed in relation to one another. So Teenie actually had originally been one of the interstitials back when it was just Aimee's story. I think she was like the first interstitial that I wrote. And so her voice had kind of been there from an early stage because I wanted to show the voice of a young person who was deeply infected. But then, because I was so captivated with her voice, it became more than that. And she gets to characterize Aimee in a different way once they interact. And then Eve was kind of pure fun. She was my way of writing Ginny's point of view without writing Ginny's point of view. I was like, okay, who is the character then who's just going to rush headlong into this no matter what the danger is? And so she felt like a release valve for Aimee. But then through Eve, and especially because Eve and Ginny ultimately end up meeting each other, that through her character, I kind of got to see how Aimee is someone different through Ginny's eyes too. And that, Aimee's more settled nature isn't necessarily the negative that Aimee saw it to be, that the kind of willing to be on the edge constantly is also not really always fun, as Eve notes eventually. So I know that there are challenges to developing this many different characters, but to me, there's also so much possibility because it shows the multifaceted natures of ourselves too.
No way! A Lego set is a gift that always clicks. And clicks. Mom, look! It's so beautiful! And clicks. For every nature lover, choose a Lego set. A gift that always clicks.
Instagram teen accounts have automatic protections for what teens see and who can contact them, plus time management tools. And Instagram will continue adding built-in safety features to help create age-appropriate experiences. Learn more about teen accounts and Instagram's ongoing work to protect teens online at instagram.com/teenaccounts.
Refreshing wild cherry cola meets smooth cream. The treat you deserve. Pepsi Wild Cherry and Cream. Treat yourself.
Yeah, and I'll have to admit that Eve was my favorite, and that I grew to like all of them. But like you, I think I needed Ginny, Virginia, to understand Aimee in a different way, and I thought that was really a brilliant move to have her meet someone so different and to find in her not only a kind of understanding of her search for her best friend, but really of herself. And so I was glad to have Ginny there as well.
Yeah, and I will tell you, Chris, you're not alone with Eve being your favorite. I think Eve is
Is that the general consensus?
I do think that is the general consensus. I get a lot of people telling me, I think I'm an Aimee, but I want to be an Eve, and I'm like, oh, you're all of them. But anyway, Eve was a lot of fun to write, so I'm glad that it feels that way to read too.
So on both the macro and micro level, the Westward women are seeking each other out. And for Aimee and Ginny, that means Seattle, where an ominous figure called the Piper has been collecting women on a bus and traveling west with them. Named for the Pied Piper, the Piper appears to be selecting the infected through various criteria to bring them westward, but his motives are clearly murkier as the novel progresses. So how does the Piper change the narrative of the drive west? What does he add in as the irritant, a different kind of infection, I think?
Yeah, I'm going to give you a brutally honest answer to this question, which is that this book needs the Piper to be published. And I guess what I mean by that is that, the eerie movement of the women going west, the conflict there is too ambiguous because the conflict, there's not like a bad guy in that exactly. The women are kind of, they're suffering from a bad guy, I guess, which is the infection, but they have ambiguous relationships with it, and it's kind of out of their control, and it originates within their own bodies, which they all have kind of mixed feelings of empowerment and fear about. But the Piper, and I don't think this is giving anything away because I was hoping this wasn't a twist. The Piper's not a good person, ultimately, and we don't have to talk about how bad of a person he is, but he's. I think it's clear from the beginning when you even hear his name that probably this guy's up to no good, and I think that you use the term the irritant to describe him, which I think is so great because that's kind of what he ends up getting to be in the story. He's the thing that is more external, that is more of an embodiment of the negatives, right? Is more an embodiment of the antagonism that is present in so many more complex and systemic ways throughout the story. The ways people try to cure the women or contain them, the feelings the women have about themselves, like all of those things are also the antagonist, but they're just simmering beneath the surface. And so the Piper can externalize them in a way. And you need that external conflict kind of that's a recognizable evil, I think, to get a book commercially published. And I don't mean that to sound too jaded. I just think that's a part of a commercial readership, that's part of plot. That's what we were talking about before. And so
Yeah.
And so when I really actually resisted having the Piper for a long time in this story, before I got an agent, I was really resisting it. And because I just think men like the Piper just aren't interesting at all. Like it's kind of predictable who the Piper ends up being. I think what is interesting is the women that he collects and the reasons they choose to go with him. He doesn't force any of them to go with him.
No.
They choose it. And we see a couple different scenes of them choosing it. And they choose to stay at a variety of points. And they choose to follow him. And, I think those things are so much more interesting than the man who, does harm to women because he likes it or thinks he has to. And so he's there, I think, as a way for us to see the women around him. Hopefully he is a little bit less the focal point, even as he catalyzes things.
There is a kind of a feeling of a certain kind of inevitability in the history of women gathering, women acting as collectivities, having movements, that it is always sort of followed by a storm of misogynistic violence in ways large and small. And your novel is, I think, very much takes that on in ways direct and indirect. And I wondered if you wanted to say a little bit about that.
Yeah, that's a great follow-up question because, of course, that is part of what the Piper is embodying, right? He is one of those people who are like many of the people that you're talking about or groups that you're talking about that use kind of chaos and confusion and upheaval for their own means, and that kind of, especially if that chaos is around women. So there's a couple different moments in the story where women, even if it's not quite as violent as the Piper is ultimately, there are kind of subtle moments of violence that happen and that are okay because of the infection. There's a moment when Eve and Ginny try to go into a restaurant and they basically get kicked out and looked at or
Yeah.
looked down upon. And the looks that the men are giving them in that scene kind of range from fear to objectification and desire, and that all of those things are okay because these women are foreign bodies, in the kind of most medical sense.
Oh, that's
Um,
nice.
and so that's, I think that we as a society, right, or as a culture, we give ourselves permission to kind of do these things large and small because of the things that we claim are fallouts. There's another moment when the newscaster says, well, think about all the other people that these women are hurting by being able to be free in the world. They leave their children behind, they leave their families behind, they might get other women sick, and that all of those are really just justifications for keeping women locked in their homes, but they don't sound that dissimilar. And I think your earlier question about historical fiction in the 70s is true to this point too, right? That like all of these things should sound pretty familiar, but we can look at them from a safe distance if we say it's the 70s. It's our own forgetfulness, to use your earlier framing.
Wow. Well, that was a great explanation to the way in which your book is existing in that historical framework and responding to it in all sorts of ways. But I am definitely anticipating the book that you withheld for your Western oriented books. And so I'm going to ask you if you have some recommendations for us, Alice.
Yeah, so I have two, and I'm going to start with the one that's the Western one since I'd teased it. I'd mentioned I'm a 19th century Americanist scholar in addition to this, and I teach 19th century American literature in addition to fiction writing. And a lot of times that means teaching stuff that was written in the 19th century. But just as I wrote about the 70s, I think it's really interesting to see people try to write about the 19th century, even though if they didn't live in it. So I'm going to really recommend, this is an old recommendation that I've loved for a long time, is Butcher's Crossing by John Williams. So John...
this was just referenced in a different podcast that I was a part of. So interesting.
Oh no, I'm not being original. The John Williams...
No, you are. You definitely are.
The John Williams book that everyone always loves is Stoner. And, I understand why. It's, it's a beautifully elegiac campus novel. Yeah, I get it. But I think Butcher's Crossing is his masterpiece. And it is, John Williams wrote this in the 1960s. It's a Western, but it takes place in the 1870s. So it's someone else looking back on a different 70s. And the premise is this like Ivy League college student basically leaves his college education and thinks, I didn't learn anything of importance there. I got to go have an adventure in the West to really like come of age, which of course is kind of what's happening in Westward Women too. So the student goes and basically just has like it's a brutal novel, an incredibly brutal experience, not just traveling westward, but specifically going on a buffalo hunting expedition. And so this is on the brink of the...
Oh, wow. Oh, gosh.
Yeah. This is on the brink of the extinction of the buffalo. And so there's just one, I was flattered to hear you call this book a fever dream at the beginning. Butcher's Crossing has it right in the center of the novel, has this insane fever dream of this student and the men he's going west with just slaughtering tons and tons of buffalo. And it's a horror story within the larger novel, but there is kind of like an erotic, manic episode that happens for them that ends in this stupor of exhaustion and gluttony. And anyway, the things that book is saying, kind of without explicitly saying it, about American consumption and how going west is a form of kind of consumption in and of itself, I think was really in my mind when I was writing Westward Women, and also just will be on my mind always because of how effective it is. Because, the Western narrative can be hopeful, but I think, the way that desire feeds on itself and will take whatever it can take to fulfill its unfulfillable bottom, is really at the heart of Butcher's Crossing. So if you're reading a John Williams this year, read
you
that one.
sold the hell out of it. So I imagine you're going to up they're going to have to bring out a new reprint after that. So
only if everyone also buys Westward Women. No, just kidding. So, so then the other book, which
it's a packaged pair. I think we gotta sell them together.
Yes, a double feature. The other one that I'm going to sell really doesn't need me to sell it right now because it has just totally exploded. But last night I was at the Great Main Street Books in Davidson, North Carolina, and those booksellers have the best recommendations in the world. And they were about the 5th people to recommend I Who Have Never Known Men to me recently because it's just had a moment. But then I stayed up all night reading it after I bought it from them. So clearly everyone's on to something. But this book, it's also kind of up the alley of Westward Women in that it's a post-apocalyptic kind of dystopian novel, feminist novel in translation from the original French. It was written in the 90s, but has just had a huge resurgence. It's by Jacqueline
Yeah, I
Hartman.
think weirdly because of Book Talk.
Yeah, right, which I always associate Book Talk as like really promoting, slightly more romance-adjacent books. But here it is doing work with a literary and translation novel. So, anyway, this novel, it really explores similar themes of female friendship and autonomy as Westward Women. And I'm a sucker for speculative literary feminist works in the vein of Margaret Atwood, which is what this is. But I think what I was impressed with most when I read it is that it's a thought experiment. It's kind of like The Cave, but for women, except that it's still incredibly propulsively active, which I find a lot of thought experiment books aren't. So I admire that, and I'll be aiming for that as I'm working on a new book. It's always good to read some tuning fork texts, and I thought that was a great tuning fork text.
You're right. It's really driving, and it has plot. It has legit plot while being an extraordinary thought experiment.
So if we can all just learn to write plot like Jacqueline Hartman.
Absolutely. Well, these are great suggestions. I now have to read Butcher's Crossing, and I already love I Who Have Never Known Men, but I really want to just recommend that my listeners run out to their local indie and get Westward Women by Alice Martin, an extraordinary historical novel that plays in the world of the dystopian, in the drive west, and in trying to understand how a movement can be both a thought experiment and a physical movement across a plane of the nation. And to think about so many of the issues that women historically have had to juggle, deal with, and understand to find a place for themselves within the nation. So it was a real treat to get to talk to you, Alice. Thank you so much.
Chris, this was such a pleasure. You're such a great reader, and it's always like an honor to talk to a really great reader about your own book. So thank you for that.
Well, thank you. And I will be very much awaiting whatever comes from you next.
Thanks, Chris.
Well, that's all for me for now. My thanks to Alice Martin for coming on to talk about her debut novel, Westward Women. You can find links to purchase Westward Women and all of Alice's recommended books at the website, burnedbybooks.com. There you'll find all of our previous episodes, links to buy a podcast t-shirt, and ways to get in contact. As you listen, take a moment to rate the show on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you find your podcasts. Until next time, this has been Burned by Books.